1, 2, chocolates for you. 3, 4, from Maynard's sweet store. 5, 6, with a strychnine mix. 7, 8, next was arsenic in the cake. 9, 10, what happened then? She donned her clothes of the very, very best, and she took all the poisons from the medicine chest in pursuit of the man of her amorous interest. Gave chocolates to his wife, which she couldn't digest. The lengths she would go to, nobody would have guessed, and the label on the cakes soon led to her arrest.
This episode contains adult themes. Listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to another episode of Prasher's Murder Map. Today I invite you to join me on a journey back to 1870s Brighton, on the south coast of England, which was the home of the notorious chocolate cream poisoner, Christiana Edmunds. Today, Brighton is a busy seaside resort, 47 miles south of London and home to about 230,000 people. It became popular in the Georgian era thanks to King George IV, who spent a lot of time in the town, and for whom the famous Royal Pavilion was built, with its distinctive dome style, reminiscent of India's Taj Mahal. Following the arrival of the railways in 1841, it became well loved by Londoners wanting to escape the busy city for a day trip to swim in the sea and visit the first purpose-built pleasure pier in England. Today, Brighton is known for its diversity, thriving cultural music and art scene, its large LGBT population and huge pride marches, and for being the first constituency in the UK to elect a Green Party Member of Parliament. Back in 1870, Brighton would have been much less busy, but had become the fastest growing town in England and was home to about 77,000 people. Christiana Edmunds was born in 1829 and grew up in Margate in Kent. After several tragedies, including the death of her sister and the incarceration of her father and brother in an asylum, she moved with her mother Anne to Brighton in 1867 to start a new life. They rented rooms at 15 Marlborough Place, in a house belonging to George and Alice Over, who soon became friends of the pair and introduced Christiana to Dr. Charles Beard, who lived nearby at 64 Grand Parade. He was a well-respected doctor of about 40 years old, married to Emily Beard and had 3 children. Christiana became Beard's patient because of her neuralgia, which is a type of nerve pain normally affecting the hands and face. The patient-doctor relationship soon developed into friendship. Dr. Beard enthralled Christiana with his stories about his travels and military adventures in Italy. She had excellent artistic skills, and in return, she would create anatomical drawings, which he hung up on the walls of the Sussex County Hospital. The friendship progressed to visits and letter writing, as many as 3 times a week. He was flattered by Christiana's attentions, but it went no further and was a case of unrequited love. Beard would soon discover that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. The Over family they lodged with noticed a change in her behaviour, and the Edmunds women soon left the house and moved to an adjacent street at 17 Gloucester Place, opposite Grand Parade. These roads still exist today, peppered with white-fronted townhouses on each side, separated by a small green park called Valley Gardens. By now, Christiana was 42 years old. Emily Beard knew nothing of the letters and happily struck up a friendship with her new neighbours. It could be that Anne Edmunds' decision to move her daughter away from the gaze of the Overs was because she was concerned that Christiana had started to display the same symptoms of insanity that her father had when he was the same age. Maybe Anne also had thoughts of her own father's death, Christiana's grandfather, who died aged 45 in 1820, having also suffered from some kind of mental illness. In September 1870, while Beard was away, Christiana visited Emily, bringing with her a gift, chocolate creams from Maynard's confectioners. This wasn't unusual, as Christiana had often visited in the past, and Emily thought nothing of it. She tried one of the chocolates, but had to spit it out because of its bitter taste. Christiana left, giving no explanations. That night, Emily suffered from pain and diarrhea. When her husband returned home, she told him about the chocolates and the resulting symptoms, and he strongly advised her to stay away from Christiana. It says a lot about his opinions of his admirer that he found no difficulty believing she would be capable of doing something like this on purpose. The next day, Dr. Beard visited Christiana at Gloucester Place and accused her outright of poisoning his wife. She refuted it strongly, claiming she had also been ill after eating the chocolates. Perhaps she hoped to get sympathy from her favourite doctor by putting on a show of histrionics. As Beard walked home, he thought about the situation and Christiana's response to his questioning. Had he been unfair in his judgment? After all, there had been cases of contamination elsewhere in the country, especially where food manufacturers wanted to keep production costs down. On one occasion, a manufacturer had reused old tea leaves by recurling them and adding dangerous chemicals like copper to give its distinctive colour. In 1858, 20 people died in Bradford after eating peppermint sweets, which had been tainted with arsenic. This was due to a mix-up of sugar and arsenic trioxide, which are both white. There had been other cases where sweets had been infused with lead to make their appearance more pleasing to children. The unlucky ones who ate them became ill, and these incidents led to the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act in 1860, which set better food hygiene standards. However, this act was just a guideline, and retailers could still add harmful ingredients to sweets and chocolates to make them appear more appetising, as well as to save money. In January 1871, Dr. Beard accused Christiana again of poisoning his wife a few months before. She denied it strenuously, and she and her mother confronted him about his slanderous accusation and threatened to seek legal advice to force him to retract his statement. Without any evidence, he reluctantly agreed to take back his comments. Christiana still felt she was under the microscope of suspicion and formulated a devious plan to divert suspicion away from her. What if there were many more cases of poisoning, seemingly random? It would surely appear as nothing more than an arbitrary accident rather than a deliberate targeting of one person. In March 1871, Christiana, wearing a thick veil in a poor attempt at disguise, gave chocolate creams to a local newsboy. He suffered from a burning throat, vomiting and stiffening of his limbs. Fortunately, he made a full recovery after a week in hospital. The same month, she visited a stationer's on the North Road and surreptitiously left a bag of chocolate creams on the counter. The stationer's son saw her do it and tried to go after her to tell her she had forgotten something, but by this time she had already fled. When she went back 4 days later, the son recognised her and tried to give the chocolates back to her. Christiana denied any knowledge of them and advised that he eat them instead, as he would be unlikely to find the owner now. He promptly took her up on the suggestion, and despite the disgusting metallic taste, he ate 10 of them. He became very ill, had a high temperature, and his body went rigid, but thankfully he did recover. Christiana visited the stationer's again a few weeks later, and left another bag of chocolates there. The stationer's son saw them, and promptly threw them in the fire. A very good decision. It seems strange to us today that anyone would even consider eating chocolates left randomly by a stranger. Unfortunately, the Victorians had no understanding of food hygiene. It seemed that Christiana wanted to frame Maynard's not because she had a personal grudge, but because she wanted to divert suspicion from herself in the attempt on Emily Beard's life. But what had she put in the chocolates, and how did she do it? At this time, poisons were readily available over the counter. You just had to go into the local chemist and sign a poison book. A form of identification was not required. What we do know is that strychnine is extracted from a tree native to India, and just 30 milligrams of it can kill an adult, so it was much more potent than arsenic, which would take 180 milligrams to cause death. It is probably more by luck than judgment that she hadn't killed anyone so far, as she'd only put a small amount into the chocolates. Strychnine also has such an unpleasant bitter taste that it alerted the victims on the first bite that something was wrong, so they wouldn't have ingested very much. If you're wondering why you could buy these poisons over the counter, strychnine was used from the 1820s onwards to treat maladies from headaches to rheumatism. In fact, one London doctor called it a wonder drug. It was also used for pest control and was freely available for the public to purchase. Strychnine symptoms usually start with a burning sensation in the throat, anxiety and restlessness, nervous system disturbance and muscle pain. Eventually the victim stops breathing and dies, usually within 1 to 2 hours. This is very similar to the symptoms of tetanus, a very painful way to die. In 1868, the Pharmacy Act imposed some rules on the purchase of poisons, but it was still very lax by the standards of today. It simply required the seller to already be acquainted with the customer by name, or for a mutually trusted third party, ideally a business owner, to vouch for the buyer and make the introductions. This is how Christiana obtained her strychnine supplies for the first time. She made a visit to Isaac Garrett, a chemist on Queen's Road, and asked if she could buy a small quantity of strychnine. Garrett had known Christiana for 4 years, but didn't know her by name. He told her she'd need a witness, in accordance with the Pharmacy Act. He suggested Caroline Stone, a milliner, who lived 3 doors down. Christiana went to Mrs. Stone's shop and introduced herself as Mrs. Wood. She told her a strange tale, that she and her fictional husband were naturalists and needed the substance for stuffing a dead bird. Mrs. Stone was surprised by the odd request and had never heard of anything like it before, but agreed to accompany her to the chemist. Christiana signed the poison book in the name of Mrs. Wood and walked away with 10 grams of strychnine. She went home to Gloucester Place and prepared for her poisoning spree. Not content with the attempted murder of Emily Beard, the newsboy and the stationer's son, she laced another bag of Maynard's chocolates with the strychnine, then went on the prowl for suitable victims. She came across Emily Baker, the 9-year-old daughter of Jessie and Harriet Baker. Christiana struck up a conversation with the child and asked if she liked chocolates and found out her name, age and address. She then presented her with the bag of chocolate creams and watched eagerly as her new young friend ran home with a spring in her step to tell her mother about the chocolates she'd been given by the nice lady while she was out playing. A few days later, Christiana decided to make a house call. She knocked on the baker's door to find out if any children had been taken ill in the area. Harriet Baker assumed she was a district visitor from the Church of England, knocking on poor families' doors. She explained that her daughter Emily had been ill and vomited for 3 days but survived. She said she'd like to get her hands on the woman who'd given her daughter the tainted chocolates. Christiana quickly made her excuses and left. Luckily for her, Emily Baker wasn't at home at the time, or she probably would have been recognised. This incident shook up Edmunds so much that she devised a new strategy of hiring young boys to go into Maynard's and purchase chocolates for her. When the boy delivered them to Christiana, she switched them out like a magician doing a conjuring trick, replacing them with chocolates she had poisoned earlier. She told the boy he had bought the wrong ones and made him go back and return them for an exchange. This way, random customers would buy the tainted chocolates while Christiana would get a fresh supply. Around this time, she went to Maynard's to complain that she had been sick herself. This was the first complaint John Maynard had received in 28 years of business in Brighton. He reluctantly agreed for Christiana to have the chocolates chemically tested by a third party, and they were sent to a Dr. Schweitzer. Meanwhile, she turned on the charm for the chemist Mr. Garrett, nurturing a friendship by discussing gardening and bringing him homegrown asparagus. Luckily for Garrett, the asparagus wasn't poisoned. As far as he was concerned, he still knew her as Mrs. Wood. This proves how adept she was at lying and creating a fake persona, a common trait for someone with psychopathic tendencies. I'll be discussing her psychological profile in more detail as we continue through this episode. On March 27th, Christiana Edmunds and her mother moved into 16 Gloucester Place, next door to where they were previously living. One of the other lodgers at number 16 had a dog, and it wasn't long before it died under mysterious circumstances. Later, evidence would come to light that when a taxidermist had been called to collect the dead animal, he had been surprised to discover that it had been poisoned by strychnine. Of course, nobody thought for a moment that the quiet, well-spoken, middle-class Miss Edmunds could have had anything to do with it. On June 12th, a Mr. Charles Miller bought some chocolates from Maynard's, which he shared with his 4-year-old nephew, Sidney Barker. Charles didn't suffer from any symptoms, but Sidney had convulsions and muscle paralysis and sadly died. The doctor who tried to save him was suspicious and called the police. A post-mortem was carried out, and the country's leading chemical expert, Dr. Letherby, examined the stomach contents and Maynard's creams, initially testing them for arsenic. When the test came back as negative, he looked for strychnine instead, as he thought that might explain the excruciating way the child had died. To do this, he mixed a sample of the boy's stomach contents with sulfuric acid and potassium dichromate. The mixture turned from purple to red within minutes, proving his theory correct. It was strychnine. So far, the other victims had survived because of the low doses in the chocolates, but poor Sidney, being so young, succumbed more easily to the poison. Maynard was also a victim in a way, as he had been running a successful confectioner's shop for 28 years, and must have been horrified to think that his chocolates had made people ill and caused the death of a child. He probably lost a lot of business from the bad press, but it seemed that not everyone in the area had heard about the poisonings. Next, showing no concern or remorse whatsoever that a child had died, Christiana visited her local grocers and left a paper bag by the door. Harriet Cole, who owned the shop with her husband, discovered it and was pleasantly surprised to find some chocolate creams inside the bag. Her daughter tried eating one of them and spat it out because of the noxious taste. Harriet then chose to pass them on to one of their best customers as a gift. If she was looking for a surefire way to hurt her business, this was it. The luckless customer ate the creams, fell ill and recovered after a few days, but didn't report it to anyone at the time. Around this time, Christiana was called to attend the inquest of Sidney Barker because the police had heard about her request for a chemical analysis on the chocolate creams and thought her evidence might be useful. The test had been negative for strychnine, but it's possible that Dr. Schweitzer didn't have the necessary skills to conduct a reliable test. When the police chemical expert Dr. Letherby was called in to testify, he confirmed that he had found strychnine in the stomach contents and 2 samples of chocolate creams, one of which came directly from the store. The verdict was accidental death caused by strychnine poisoning, and Maynard was urged to be more careful in the future. It was thought that the strychnine could have come from rat poison, which had somehow contaminated the chocolates, but nobody could suggest how this might have happened. After the inquest, Edmunds left triumphant, feeling that she had been exonerated and the blame placed squarely on Maynard. Despite attending the inquest and hearing the gruesome details of the 4-year-old's death, Christiana still showed no remorse. A few days later, she wrote a letter to Dr. Beard about her experiences at the inquest, reassuring him that she knew he hadn't really meant his accusations against her. When scrutinised today, in light of modern developments in psychology, the letter shows her desire to sound intelligent and was peppered with quoted poetry and Italian phrases such as referring to Beard's wife as La Sposa and her mother as La Madre. Dr. Beard had previously told her stories of his time in Italy, so maybe she did this to present herself as well-cultured and travelled, which is very far from the truth.
Caro mio, you have been so miserable since my last letter to you. I can't go on without ever speaking to you. However, dear, I mean you to know about this dreadful poisoning case, especially as I had to give evidence, and I know how interested you would be in it, as you told me you would give me anything to know what La Sposa swallowed. You can fancy what I felt. Such an array of gentlemen, and that clever Dr. Lefferby. Looking so ugly and so terrific frightened me more than anyone else. For if I gave wrong symptoms, of course he would have known. You fancy my feelings, standing therefore before the public, looking very rosy and frightened as I was. Now, darling, rest assured, through the whole affair I have never mentioned your name or La Sposa's. Act as your kind heart tells you, and make a poor little thing happy. And fancy a long, long kiss from me.
For some reason, she signed her letters to Beard as Dorothea. Some sources suggest she did this because she thought of herself like Saint Dorothea, a woman from the 4th century who was tortured for her Christian beliefs. This is another piece of evidence suggesting her self-importance and grandiose tendencies, as she wasn't content with just signing her own name like most people do. She mentioned how careful she was not to bring Dr. Beard's name into it, probably because she knew an interrogation about her feelings towards the doctor would show a very clear motive for wanting to get rid of his wife. In her letter, there was no mention of the suffering of the families involved, and only concern about how she had been affected by having to attend the inquest. Not content with writing to her paramour, she penned 3 letters in June 1871 to young Sidney Barker's father, urging him to take further action against Maynards. These letters were anonymous and purported to be from 3 different people, but were found later to have been written by Christiana. Interestingly, she made these letters sound sympathetic and presented herself as a parent who understood what he was going through. This seems to be a very deliberate decision, as she hadn't shown a shred of concern for the victims before.
I felt great interest in the case, and fully sympathise with your loss. The public mind is not satisfied, and feel great blame is attached to Maynard for selling to your family chocolates from the same stocks he had been warned against. I think Mr. Maynard will not escape scot-free. My feeling of disgust is felt by most of the influential and respectable inhabitants of this town. Such a deadly poison as strychnine ought hardly to be in existence.
In one letter, she also tried to insert herself into the case again by suggesting that Mr. Barker seek out the young lady who had been at the inquest, clearly referring to herself, despite the fact that in those days 40 was hardly seen as young. Her other letters did not mention the young lady again, which shows extraordinary cunning for someone from a pre-CSI and Criminal Minds era. She obviously didn't want to make it seem too obvious that the letters were written by her. The inquest had already found that the poisoning was Maynard's fault, and Christiana was completely off the hook, so why did she try to push Sidney's father into taking further legal action against Maynard? I think this wasn't just about unrequited love and proving to Beard that she was innocent of trying to kill his wife. It seems to me that Beard was just a catalyst for her vindictive and malicious streak to emerge, maybe due to repressed anger and frustration at a sheltered and boring existence, having lived with her mother for the whole 42 years of her life. Perhaps Anne Edmunds was overprotective, given the series of tragedies that had struck the family, clinging to what she had left. I suspect Christiana had a rich fantasy life, and may have imagined for some time how it would feel to have the power to hurt people. She was also unusually eager to insert herself into the investigation, a common trait that we see emerging as a pattern in serial killers over the next century. In any case, Mr. Barker ignored the letters and chose not to take her advice, but felt the unwanted correspondence was such a damn nuisance that he took them to the police. He wasn't the only one annoyed by Christiana's letters. Her hopes were raised when Beard came to visit her, but it wasn't to renew their friendship, but to tell her to stop writing to him and that he didn't want to see her again. He showed the letters to his wife Emily, and Christiana felt shocked and betrayed. Her perception of the relationship between herself and Charles Beard was clearly at odds with the reality. After he left, Anne Edmunds apparently found her daughter pacing the room saying, "I shall go mad, I shall go mad," and bluntly told her, "You are mad already." On June 8th, Christiana Edmunds tried a new tactic to get hold of Poison, forgetting about her act as Mrs. Wood. She sent a message boy with a note to Garrett's chemist, pretending to be Messrs. Glacier and Kemp, requesting half an ounce of strychnine. This was a clever move, as Glacier and Kemp were real chemists, and Christiana knew they were known to Garrett, and that chemists often supplied each other when short. Garrett sent the boy back with a note, saying that he only had 1/8 of an ounce, and they would need to send him an order note before he could sell it to them. Not to be deterred, Christiana responded boldly, saying that she would not send an order note, as their signature had always been enough before, and if Garrett didn't want to supply them, they would take their business elsewhere. Garrett was convinced. He took the 1 shilling and 3p that Christiana had provided the messenger with, and handed over the strychnine. With the new supply, she set to work adulterating a fresh batch of chocolate creams, and paid a boy to return them to Maynard's shop on the pretense that she'd bought the wrong ones. Once again, they ended up back in the supply chain to be sold on to unsuspecting customers. Following the success of this letter, she wrote to Garrett again, this time pretending to be the coroner, demanding to look at the poison book. He was keen to help the coroner out, and fell for the ruse. He handed the book over to the message boy, who delivered it back to Edmunds. Oddly, she didn't tear out the page showing the entry where she'd signed for strychnine as Mrs. Wood, and instead tore out a page either side of it, then sent the book back to Garrett. It's not clear why she did this, but maybe it was simply to confuse and misdirect. She soon realised that strychnine wasn't doing the job properly, and decided to try arsenic instead, which was well suited to poisoning food as it was tasteless, odourless and colourless. Maybe this time she hoped her victims wouldn't spit the chocolates out in disgust, and would eat enough for it to prove fatal. She once again sent a note to Garrett, pretending to be Glacier and Kemp, asking to buy arsenic. Garrett became suspicious, and decided to visit Glacier and Kemp to check that the note was genuine. Worryingly, they didn't know anything about it, or the previous one requesting strychnine. Garrett went straight to the police and told Inspector Gibbs. There were many chemists in Brighton at that time, so Garrett's refusal to reply to her note didn't worry Christiana too much. She had plenty of other options. She sent a letter to Samuel Bradbury instead, who she had heard was due to cease trading soon and leave Brighton. He fell for the trick, just as Garrett had done at first, and sent her 3 ounces of arsenic, enough to kill hundreds. Soon, Christiana received a letter from Inspector Gibbs, asking her to clarify some information from her previous complaint about Maynard's. She hoped this might be the start of the further investigation she'd been hoping for, and tried to insert herself into the action again by taking a response to him in person. They conversed, and he told her about the recent poisoning cases, and she reminded him that she herself had been made ill twice by Maynard's creams. But Inspector Gibbs was already suspicious of Christiana, and his reason for writing to her was to obtain a sample of her handwriting. All the victims he had interviewed had mentioned seeing a lady who fit her description exactly. He sent her letter to a handwriting expert for analysis, along with the forged letter Garrett had brought him. Meanwhile, Anne Edmunds was troubled by her daughter's deteriorating state of mind, and worried that she would soon end up in an asylum like her father, but as far as we know, she didn't discuss her concerns with anyone at the time. Even today, there's still a taboo around mental health, and back then, it just wasn't something people talked about. Their house servant Charlotte became suspicious when Christiana asked her to dispose of a tray full of unlabelled packets of powder. Charlotte kept one of the packets, and would later give this to Inspector Gibbs as evidence. On August 8th, Christiana took a trip to Margate, telling her mother she was going to visit her sister's grave. Anne was pleased and thought the fresh air would be good for her daughter's health, but Christiana hadn't told the whole truth. While staying at Mrs. Bareling's lodging house in Margate, it was noticed that she had some boxes with her, full of crystallised sweets and fruits. Unbeknownst to anyone, Christiana returned to Brighton via London, and the reason for this became horribly clear a couple of days later. On August 10th, a railway van from London delivered a parcel to Emily Beard containing cakes, preserved fruits, gingerbread nuts and plum cakes. The note said it was a gift for her and her children, but was anonymous. Mrs. Beard saw nothing strange about this and decided to save the treats for the weekend. A package was also delivered to Elizabeth Boys, wife of a retired solicitor who lived nearby. They received 2 pieces of gingerbread, 2 macaroons, 2 cheesecakes and 2 currant cakes. She also planned to give these to her children after lunch the next day. Similar parcels were received by Garrett the chemist, the editor of the Brighton Gazette, and a local surgeon and borough magistrate. Interestingly, Christiana had also sent a parcel to herself. On Saturday night, a surgeon was called to the boys' home as 2 servants were suffering from pain, nausea, vomiting and trembling after eating items from the parcel. At first, the surgeon didn't think this was suspicious until he was stopped in the street on his way home and was begged to visit the Beards' house, where oddly they also had 2 servants with identical symptoms. The surgeon carefully gathered samples of the sweets and the servants' vomit and noticed a strange white powder on the preserved fruit. Experts at Sussex County Hospital confirmed the presence of arsenic. 1 piece of cake contained a huge 580 milligrams, enough to kill 2 adults. Inspector Gibbs was still suspicious of Christiana and decided to pay her a visit. She herself appeared to have been taken ill and claimed to have been violently sick. The label on the sweets sent to her said Christina rather than Christiana, a cunning attempt to make it look as though the sender didn't know her very well. Gibbs explained to her about the parcels and how many other people had received them, and Christiana rather mockingly said, "How very strange, I feel certain you'll never find it out." Gibbs sent the handwritten labels from the cakes to Frederick Netherclift, the handwriting expert, to whom he'd also sent Christiana's letter and the forged letter. Netherclift confirmed they were all the same, but the inspector was aware that he needed more rock-solid evidence before he could make an arrest. An advert was placed in the Brighton Gazette on August 12th, offering a £20 reward for any information on the recent poisonings. Dr. Beard saw the advert on his return home after being away on business for a few days, and as soon as he discovered that his wife had been targeted again, he went straight to the inspector to voice his suspicions. He told the whole story of Christiana's obsession with him, and the motive for her actions now became clear to Gibbs. A warrant was put out for her arrest, and over the following weeks more evidence was gathered and she was tried for 1 count of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. Christiana seemed stoic and unconcerned as the evidence against her was presented at the trial. Emily Baker, the 9-year-old girl who had fallen foul of Edmunds early on in the poisoning spree, identified Christiana as the woman who had given her the chocolates that made her ill, and 2 of the messenger boys she had used also confirmed the identification. If this wasn't enough, the toxicology reports and handwriting analysis were also damning. The defence lawyer, Parry, tried to convince the jury she was insane to avoid the death penalty. If he was unable to convince them, she would be declared sane and executed under the McNaughton rules. He put forward the case that Christiana didn't know right from wrong and lacked remorse. He found an alienist, the old-fashioned word for a psychiatrist, who agreed with him and believed her condition was hereditary. Throughout the trial, Edmunds remained stone-faced, either unaware of the grave consequences of her actions or simply uncaring as to her fate. The jury took 1 hour to find her guilty and sane at the time of murder. Judge Martin donned the black cap and sentenced her to death. Desperately trying to delay the inevitable, Christiana claimed she was pregnant, but was quickly proven to be lying. Perhaps at this point she began to realise how serious the situation was. While being transported from Newgate to Lewes Prison, she tried to jump out of the moving carriage, raving that Dr. Beard was the cause of all the trouble. The public found it hard to accept that Edmunds was truly evil, and in those days people tended to believe that women were mad, not bad, sensitive creatures prone to hysteria. There was always fascination with cases of killer women as they broke the nurturing, homemaking stereotype prevalent in the 1800s. Petitions were signed and sent to the Queen begging for leniency. Christiana was examined by Dr. Gull, who found she was of unsound mind, and the Home Secretary accepted this in January 1872. The death sentence was commuted and she was sent to Broadmoor Asylum. Some critics were dissatisfied with the decision, believing that she had been spared the noose only because of her middle-class background. On July 5th, she arrived at Broadmoor, cheeks painted with rouge and wearing false hair and teeth. Until Broadmoor had been opened, there had previously been nowhere for what they called criminal lunatics except for 2 wings at the Bethlehem Hospital in London, commonly known as Bedlam. Broadmoor allowed a lot of freedom for its patients within the boundaries of its walls, and they spent time sewing, painting, playing croquet and tending the vegetable garden. There were about 100 women at Broadmoor, and most of them had killed or tried to kill their own children or people they knew, so Edmunds was unusual as she had targeted strangers. The superintendent, Dr. Orange, described her as quiet and orderly, but said she showed no remorse and offered no explanation for her actions, and even years later, at the age of 60, she was still preoccupied with her appearance and attention seeking. Interestingly, another famous name in Broadmoor at the time was Robert Coombs, who murdered his mother aged 13 and later turned his life around to become a hero of the First World War. Look out for the full story about him in a future episode. When Christiana's mother visited her to relay the bad news of her brother's death in South Africa, Dr. Orange noted that she appeared quite unable to experience any feeling of sorrow, although she tried to look grieved. Letters between Christiana and her surviving sister Mary focused on makeup and clothing, and Mary often sent her beauty items and false hair. Christiana started sending amorous letters to Reverend Henry Cole, which she tried to hide from the staff. She frequently complained about other patients and tried to stir up trouble. In the last years of her life, she suffered from various illnesses, including flu and dyspepsia, and spent a lot of time in the infirmary. There's a record of a conversation she had with a fellow patient just months before her death. She asked how she looked and whether her eyebrows were alright, before going on to talk about an upcoming dance for the patients.
I think I am improving. I hope I shall be better in a fortnight. If so, I shall astonish them. I shall get up and dance. I was a Venus before, and I shall be a Venus again.
She died in September 1907 of old age, having been in Broadmoor for almost 40 years. Judging by everything we've heard, I think Edmunds suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. Common characteristics of this are having an inferiority complex, a desire to be the centre of attention, and lacking empathy for others. She also displayed elements of a histrionic personality, which can include inappropriately seductive behaviour and a need for approval. Imagine a B-movie actress really hamming it up for the camera. We see this in her excessive vanity and self-styling as the Venus of Broadmoor, as well as her warped understanding of her relationship with Dr. Beard and the love letter she sent to the Reverend Henry Cole. Because she felt herself inferior, she was always looking to prove that she was better than anyone else, such as through her use of Italian phrases in her letters to appear better educated and well-travelled than she really was, as well as her habit of stirring up trouble with other Broadmoor patients. There was an element of power and control which was evident in her mode of poisoning and the enjoyment she felt in knowing that her actions were making people ill across town. She also liked to manipulate people into doing what she wanted them to, seen by her letters to the chemists, tricking them into selling her poisons, and her messages to Sidney Barker's father, urging him to take the case against Maynard's further. With everything we know about Christiana Edmunds, I'm convinced that if she hadn't been caught, she would have continued with her poisoning spree and would ultimately have become a serial killer. We can only hope that the understanding of mental health continues to improve, so that we can learn why people like Edmunds behave the way they do, and prevent similar tragedies happening again. Thanks for listening to an episode of Prasha's Murder Map. If you enjoyed today's episode, the best way to let me know is to leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. If you wish to leave feedback, you can also reach me at prashesmurdermap@gmail.com. Next week, we'll be uncovering the bloody massacre of the Ratcliffe Highway murders, where 7 people were killed in as many days. So until then, take it easy everyone.